there are many times where we give up our authenticity to try to get attachment. And so, but in giving up that part of our authenticity is the instinctual part of ourselves and the knowing from the inside out. And when we give that up to try to get attachment, we lose both. We lose authenticity, and we also lose attachment, because attachment without authenticity is not true attachment. It's a pseudo-attachment.
Hello. Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast. My name is Blake Chalfant, and today the episode goes deep. We go into all things human development, attachment, and coming from a guy who has over 50 years of experience working with people, teaching other therapists, being on the earth for almost 74 years. Truly an honor to sit down with Mr. Duey Freeman. Duey is a sought-after teacher, trainer, licensed therapist, and equine professional worldwide. He has taught worldwide and developed a practical attachment theory and human development theory taught to thousands of university students. He has nearly 80,000 direct client hours and co-founded the Gestalt Equine Institute and the Gestalt Institute of the Rockies. He supervises therapists and graduate students and does business and land consultations for new equine therapy sites. Today's episode is for all of humans because we all go through attachment experiences. And unfortunately, in our modern world, most of us have attachment issues, which end up polluting so many different aspects of our lives, in particular, our ability to be in healthy relationships with others. And so I highly encourage everybody to stick around, listen to the show. It's truly an honor to get to sit down with someone who has walked the earth for so long and accumulated so much raw wisdom about how humans really work. Before we get into the episode, if you're new here, please leave a like, subscribe, share the show, give us a rating. It does help the channel grow a lot. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did. Duey Freeman, welcome to the Human Experience Podcast.
Well, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here. Thanks, Blake.
Yeah, preparing for this episode, I realized that there was so much that I wanted to talk to you about, and I totally went into my own process around the fear of not being able to actually touch on everything. So I'm going to let go of that and just see where the conversation wants to take us.
That sounds great to me. And a lot of times my experience is that we may not, when I speak, we may not get to everything, but there's so much of everything that we work with and I talk about is like intertwined and overlap. So we'll see what we can get to today.
Sounds good. So for everyone who does not know who you are, give us a little brief summary of the origin story of Duey Freeman.
That'll take up the first hour and a half. Well, a lot of what I talk about is attachment development, and a lot of what I work with people is that actually came from, I mean, obviously at the time, I didn't know, but where any of this would go because I was an infant, actually still in utero. There have been numbers of major significant incidences that have happened in my life. One of them is that when my mother was pregnant with me in 1949, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And at that time, there were not any of the drugs that would be applicable to help cure tuberculosis. There was not the antibiotics that there are now. So if you could imagine the fear that ran through her and ran through my father, they had a little girl who was one, my older sister, and what that would do to them and what that would bring about even biochemically and neurologically for me. And nobody even looked at that stuff then. So a lot of my path in my life has been looking at those kinds of things. Thankfully, I was born healthy. My mother was whisked away and spent 18 months in the sanitarium. I stayed with my father, my grandfather, my grandmother, my sister, and that has been the foundation of a lot of the work that I've done. I didn't move back in with my family, with my mother in particular, until I was 18 months old. And there are newspaper articles that speak and basically say that about me moving back in like I was like a neighborhood kid. That's a quote from my mother. So that's been something that has been big in my life and early in my life. I didn't know how big it was. Even to the point of it drove a lot of what I did in my childhood and adolescence, and even to the point of it driving what I did as an adult and how I was and how I was in relationship. So that's the core of the origin of where I began. Throughout my life, I've done a lot of different things. Maybe I don't know that it'd be helpful to anyone for me to start listing things, but certainly as I go through this podcast, we can bring some of those things in. What I will say, so that people have some context, is I was through a whole series of events. I graduated as an engineer and with a degree in engineering and physics in 1970, and was very, very involved in civil rights and anti-war issues at the time. And that ended up driving me away from engineering and into working with people. And my first experience in working with kids was with an Outward Bound program. And then that's the foundation of all the rest of the work that I've done. So just briefly, I've been at this. Actually, Saturday will be my birthday, and I'll be 74. And so I've been at this 54 years at this point, in one way or another. So we can incorporate other kinds of things into that as we go, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that.
Yeah, thank you. So you've been doing therapy for almost twice as old as I am. And
okay, fair enough.
And it's such an honor to have you here because of that. So let's use the first part of your origin story maybe to start talking about attachment in a little bit, and why that was such an important part of your life and your life's work. So
sure.
Yeah, let's start there.
Sure. Well, part of what happened for me is I like anybody else, was desperate for relationships. I wanted to have relationships with friends, with professional relationships, with partners, with, even marital relationships, and being really close to women, being involved intimately and deep long-term relationships with women. And what was happening in my early 20s is I would start those, and it wouldn't be that long until I end up messing them up, either through lack of trust or lack of ability to deal with my own issues, lack of ability to be close. I certainly had anger issues that I was going, where did these come from? Those sorts of things. I was fortunate enough in my early to mid 20s to run into a man, he was an MD psychiatrist named Foster Cline. And people may know him better. He and a guy named Jim Fay wrote a series of books called Parenting with Love and Logic. But Foster was one of the first people who really looked at attachment with children. And I worked with him. He was actually my first clinical supervisor. But I was also the principal of a school I became principal at 27, which God only knows why anyone would hire me at 27 to be a principal of a school. And between working with him and talking with him and seeing what he was doing, as well as there was a time where I was dating a woman who was adopted, and she turned me on to very different books around adoption and the whole process of being adopted and what happens in the process of attachment with people who are adopted. And when I was working with foster and learning from him. I started looking at the process that people went through when they were being adopted, or adults who had been adopted as infants. What hit me was I was experiencing the exact same thing that people who had been adopted had experienced, where part of what happens in adoption is, and this is what happened to me, is we actually attach in utero. That's our first attachment. And people used to think that we were sort of blank slates, and then we would be born and then we would start an attachment process. Well, the reality is that we start our attachment process in utero. And my attachment process in utero was interrupted because of the fear of my mother. And they didn't even know if she would live to long enough for me to be born. And so I started exploring those. Those were the two main influences about that drove me to really look at the beginnings of what went on with attachment, but also what went on with me. And one of the things I'll throw in here is that many people will talk about attachment disorders, and I don't see it that way. I don't see that attachment as a disorder. And I'll be happy to talk about some other things around attachment. I don't see, there's a lot of stuff out there around secure attachment and insecure avoidant and insecure anxious and insecure disorganized. I don't look at it that way either. But part of what I started doing was is really exploring my own process of attachment and really exploring how that went well and how that went horribly. And one of the biggest pieces in working with attachment and attachment issues is the process of grieving the loss of a parent. Like when a child is born, and this really began with when I was working with people who were adopted, and then also with my own stuff, is that we become incredibly attached. In fact, in utero, we end up feeling as if we're one with our parent, with our mothers. And birth is the first separation, but when the same person is there, meaning our mothers, we are able through a process to continue that attachment process. When we're taken from our mothers, whether it be because my mother was ill or because of a person relinquishing somebody for attachment, relinquishing a baby for attachment, that completely severs that relationship. And and we don't know what's happening. And if people could even imagine a person whom they loved right now in their life, regardless of their age, if they could imagine that person that they're the closest to, that they're and could imagine what they look like, what they smell like, what it feels like to be around them, and then have that person disappear with no ability to know where they went, no ability to search for them, no ability to ask what happened, and then that's the first step in the process. So you could even imagine that for a moment. That's part of what happens. And then the next thing that happens is someone else comes in and says, oh, I'm here and I'm going to replace that person. And most people, when they look at that process, or walk through an experiential with that process of knowing who they love and all of the sensory process around that person, and that person disappears and someone steps in and goes, well, here I am, I'm going to love you the same as that person. Most people go, forget it. And that's what happens in adoption. That is also what happens if mothers are sick, if mothers are like my mother was, or if mothers have postpartum depression, if mothers are overwhelmed. There's so many reasons that we can end up with what I call fragmented attachment. And the reason I call it that is because I see attachment on a continuum. We're not either attached or not attached. That's not how we work. So we sort of end up with feeling fragmented inside is what happened. And we don't quite know where that comes from. We don't know what that feels. We don't even know what it feels like not to be fragmented. And we just know that something isn't quite right. So that's what I ended up working on, and that's what, on a personal level, but it's also what I work on with people therapeutically.
Gotcha. Yeah, it makes me think about all the babies who, when they come out, they go straight into the NICU and are separated from their mothers.
Completely.
So before we go any further, I just want to rewind and really nail down what is attachment for all the people who maybe aren't even familiar with that word.
Okay. I have a very specific definition, so let me pull this up, because I want people to really get this, and what I may do 3 or 4 segments of this. Does that work okay for you?
Yeah. Imagine you're talking to the 18-year-old young dude who has no idea what attachment is.
Got it. Well, it's almost everybody that doesn't have any idea what attachment is, so we won't just narrow it to 18-year-old young men. Attachment is a deep, emotional, energetic, instinctual, and the instinctual part is huge here, trust-based bond between two beings that is created and shared over time. So one of the things that definition says is that we can be adults and create attachment with other people. You and I have I would say a pretty solid attachment relationship with the time that we've spent together in various settings. And, and it's and it's not just oh yeah, Blake's a good dude. It's there's something energetic. There's something trust-based. There's something instinctual about a connection. And one of the things that happens when we lose attachment is that we end up with that instinctual part doesn't get to play a role. Many times we shut that down. And actually, frankly, a lot of young men shut that down. Shut down the instinctual part. When we can create that emotional, energetic, instinctual, trust-based bond, what happens is that when that's there, we form what's called an I, thou, we relationship. The I, thou concept that's a very old concept, first sort of spoken about by a guy named Martin Buber in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And interestingly enough, one of the things that I do in my work is work with horses, with people. I work with horses, but I also work with people assisted by horses. But Martin Buber's first I-thou experience came with a horse, interestingly enough, when he was 11 years old. And he went back and started looking at that. And what I-thou is getting that the other person that I'm in relationship with has just as deep, just as powerful, just as valid of an experience as I do, and that is very different. So one of the pieces that really is important in all of this work is to know that we meet at our differences, not where we're the same, which is an interesting concept. It's like the more diverse we are, the more healthy the relationship. And I mean, just like when we started, you said, I've been working therapeutically about twice as long as you are old. Well, your experience in life has been very different than my experience was in life, but it's just as valid. And it's like, oh, I want to know your experience. I want, and that's where we can meet. And so in our work, then when the attachment comes in, it's an I-thou, and the way I write it out is there's a dash or a slash. It's like I/thou/we. And the we part is where we connect. The we part is where we go, where that attachment actually is. And if you could imagine a bit of a Venn diagram, it's sort of almost like two circles that overlap. And that's where the attachment happens. Attachment can take place at any time in our lives. So a lot of what I talk about and work with is early on, what's called the original attachment. And that original attachment primarily takes place beginning in utero, deepens through our birthing process, and then continues for our first couple of years of life. So let me talk a little bit more about this and just bring in a couple other things, and we can riff on wherever we want to go here. Original attachment happens in a solid attuned manner when our original attachment happens in a really solid attuned manner between our mother, ourselves and our mothers, and ourselves and our fathers. Fathers are a really big part of this. We create what's called a healthy blueprint, and we carry that blueprint throughout our lives to have relationships. When the original attachment process happens in a more fragmented way, meaning a mother or a caregiver is there part of the time or is only able to be there sort of halfway energetically. Let's say somebody is overwhelmed or they're sick or those kinds of things. We end up with what I call a fragmented blueprint. And fragmented blueprints are the part of, they're the process that happens when that we internalize, and it's actually a somatic process that happens internally. And both healthy and fragmented blueprints create conscious and unconscious expectations in our relationships, and they become the water we swim in. So if I have a really healthy attachment, I'm going to assume that that's what's going to happen between me and you, or me and anyone else. If I have a fragmented attachment, I'm going to assume that's what happened, because that's what's real for me at the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So go ahead. And then I do have one other piece in here that'll help tie all of this together.
You want to go ahead and do that, and then we can move on?
Sure. At its core, attachment and trust develop when we can predictably go through a tough time in contact, in relationship with another being, and come out okay. And that's the core. I put together a whole attachment theory, but that's the core of that theory.
Will you say that again?
Yes. At its core, attachment and trust develop when we can predictably go through a tough time in contact, in relationship with another, and come out okay. And
let me make sure. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Let me make sure I'm getting this right, though. And attachment can occur at any point throughout our lives. However, there is this original attachment that happens, which is, you said, primarily in your utero to around 18 months or something around that?
Yeah, it begins in utero. And this is when everything goes well. It begins in utero, and then it takes from our birth to about 18 months to 2 years is when we really form that deep attachment with our parents.
And would you say a good way to think about that kind of is like the foundational structure of the way that we relate with the world?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Is that if that attachment is solid, then that's a foundation of how we relate with the world and every relationship. If that attachment is fragmented, then that's how we go through the world and what we do in relationship. So it's interesting. When I'm working with people, they'll come in, and when I talk about this, they go, yeah, my marriage is fragmented. Because people can recognize that. And that's why I actually use that term instead of, and I will bring in a piece here around to sort of tie this into Bowlby stuff, which is the secure and the insecure attachment. But people feel more fragmented than they feel insecure is what really happens.
Gotcha.
It's like people go, I don't know how to be all the way here for you. And I see that all the time when I'm working with couples or even friends. Like earlier today, there are two brothers whose parents are dying, and they're adult men. They're like 30 plus, and they have the attachment in their family was so fragmented that they have a fragmented relationship with each other.
Gotcha.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. Something that I want to do is normalize this. Something that I've heard you say when I was at your retreat is that most people have some sort of attachment wounding, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I call them attachment wounding or attachment issues or something along that line. I'm very careful not to pathologize because this is not a sickness. It's not a disorder.
Yeah. Okay. So I heard you say that the high majority of people in our world today have some sort of attachment issues. And I'm thinking for all the people who really aren't aware of their attachment stuff, and they're saying to themselves, well, I wasn't adopted and my mother was present for the first 2 years of my life. Like, can you normalize it a little bit and maybe give us some ways that, like some red flags, I guess, to know that maybe we have some attachment stuff that we didn't know about?
Yes. Let me bring in one other piece that will really help with that. When I spoke about the core piece of being able to go through a tough time in contact, in relationship, that contact piece is incredibly important. But let me give you my definition of contact. So all of these definitions I'm giving are mine. And so you will hear other things out there in the world. So just know that. It doesn't mean that the other people are wrong. I'm just saying that this is how I'm defining this. Contact is a moment of present, attuned meeting of another at our emotional, energetic, and or spiritual boundaries. And I actually left out physical there. Meeting of another at our physical, emotional, energetic, and or spiritual boundaries. So what I oftentimes have people do is put their hands maybe 2 feet apart and slowly bring them in. And at some point, they'll start feeling sort of an energy between their hands. There's a sphere from one hand to the other. That's the energetic contact boundary is what it's called. If we touch our hands physically, that's a physical contact boundary. And we can do those same things on an emotional level and on a spiritual level. What the key piece for people really wondering whether they're struggling with attachment is whether or not they're able to make contact. And what do they do in their lives to promote contact, and what do they do in their lives to inhibit contact? And then here's the tie-in to the stuff that Bowlby talks about with the insecure avoidant and insecure anxious and insecure disorganized, is that people will avoid contact, or they'll be anxious about contact, or they'll be disorganized about contact, because our ability to make contact is a building block for all attachment. Because contact is actually a relatively short piece. It's like really looking somebody in the eye when you're talking, or really being able to hear what someone else is saying. You really be able to feel what someone else is feeling. And some of the things that people can do that I would ask people is, when you're talking to somebody, can you look them in the eye? Can you have a soft focus and look them in the eye? Can you have a sense of what that person is really saying to you? Not just saying the words, but you being able to feel it from the inside out. Can you, when let's say you're in a relationship and you're being sexual, are you able to be fully there? If you're making love with somebody, can you look them in the eye when you're making love? Can you fully embrace who they are, or are you stuck in your genitals? Mm-hmm. And can you, if someone were to ask me right now what's going on in my body, I can immediately tell anybody anything about what's going on in my body. But there are many people that I would say, people would say, I'll ask them what's going on in your body, and they go, I don't know. What do you feel in your gut? I don't know. I'm full. And so what we're really looking at is our ability to truly make contact with another being and make contact with ourselves. Because contact is that building block for attachment.
Yeah. Something that I mean, the way that I'm interpreting what you're saying with contact is that it's not merely sharing space with other people. Like, I can go into a room with all of my guys and hang out, and we're laughing, we're having a good time, but no one is making contact with each other. Exactly. Right? And that feels like a really important distinction, is like, contact doesn't mean just hanging out with people. It's the quality of how we're hanging out with people. And I know for me, growing up, it was rare that I ever made contact with anyone.
Yes. And there are many families that there's precious little contact at all in the family. Like there's food provided. And this, I'm going to wrap this back around to a piece that you mentioned earlier, where it was like, people go, well, I wasn't abused and, I wasn't adopted. But it's literally for instance, when you were being fed, when your diapers were being changed, when you were struggling to go to sleep, or all of those kinds of things, were your parents 100% in contact with you? Whomever was doing that. Or, like, for instance, a way to not be in contact is, and actually I have a really good friend in New York who did a study with this, a woman friend. And the reason I specifically say woman friend is because she actually videoed mothers breastfeeding, which I probably couldn't get away with in an ethical way. And, and if they're not in contact with their baby, part of what happens is their arm goes down, they're not paying attention, maybe they're on their phone, maybe there's 3 other kids running around, maybe they're worried about being evicted, maybe mom and dad had a fight the night before, somebody's worried about paying a bill, all of those kinds of things. And it's like, the whole idea of things like letting your baby cry themselves to sleep, or, okay, so you're tired, so give them a bottle and let them lay and nurse from the bottle. All of those things, there's no contact in that. And even what you said, it's like a lot of dudes can be hanging out and they're laughing and joking and, and it's fun. I mean, I've done that. It's so much fun. And a lot of times there's precious little contact.
Mm-hmm.
So, and again, not everything doesn't have to be heavy duty. Not everything is like processing everything, and not everything is like dropping in and going, okay, here's my biggest struggle in the world. That's not what we're talking about. I mean, sometimes
Right.
that's it, but sometimes it's like, so let me give an example. Every evening we feed our horses 3 times a day. And the last time I go up at 9-ish, something like that. And I'm doing that just to check on them, make sure they're safe, everything's good. So that I actually sleep better knowing that my horses are in good shape. But when I walked back into the house, my partner, Kimberly, had just read this piece and she had tears in her eyes. And she said, would you just come and sit next to me? And it was like, and my comment was, hey babe, what's going on? And she said, just please sit next to me. And so I did. And we were probably there half an hour. And there was very little talking other than her sharing that what had prompted her to go where she went emotionally. But it was like, I'm just here, babe. And I was breathing with her. She sort of snuggled up to me a little bit, and it was just like that level of contact of that I'm here and you're here and we're here together. And the world's an okay place to be right now. So that's what I'm talking about. There wasn't any trying to fix anything. There wasn't any problem solving involved. And again, there was precious little talking, probably in a half an hour. I might have said 30 or 40 words. But it was like, can you be here?
Yeah. It reminds me of a piece that you shared around bringing awareness to how old the person that you're with is in that moment. And so, like, sometimes when I'm getting really upset, really it's 4-year-old Blake coming to the surface, the Blake that needed attention or whatever it was, that someone wasn't there for him. And I think about how many times people in relationship are actually just children fighting each other and they're trying to figure things out, or maybe one person's going back into, their inner child and the other person's trying to have an argument with them or talk through something as if they're 2 adults, but actually in that moment, one person isn't present.
Yeah, absolutely. Well,
can you expand on that?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And let me talk about that a little bit, because here's what I actually see people do. And I'm actually impressed and honored that you remember this stuff, because it's really cool. I mean, one of the pieces that I've been so impressed with you about is how serious you are. I'm going to not use the word serious, how integrous you are around learning. And
thank you.
And that you really, really want to learn this stuff, and you have a lot of integrity around trying to learn this stuff,
Thank you.
which I deeply appreciate. One of the pieces that I see with us is that as we grow, we go through many developmental stages. And everybody does. We go through physical development, we go through emotional development, we go through what is being called social engagement development, we go through intellectual development. There's 4 or 5 sort of strands in there. And sometimes we'll grow physically more than we will emotionally, and those don't always happen at the same place and time. And actually, let me throw a piece in here. Sort of as an aside, because this is really big, especially working with boys and young men, is that we as boys and we as young men tend to develop slower than girls do, and girls and young women. And around 5 or 6 will probably about a year, especially on sort of the social emotional development and even cognitive development. We're about a year behind girls. In adolescence, we're about 18-ish months plus or minus behind. As we become young men, we're developmentally about 18-ish months behind young women. In our mid-20s and mid to late 20s, we actually catch up. And then just depending on the person, we're between young men and young women. They're some of us develop better, in some areas than others, but we're essentially equitable. But we as boys and men develop more slowly. If anyone wants to really dive into that, look into what Richard Rees has to say. Terry Real talks about that some. But the person out there that I think has done the best job with it right now is Richard Rees. Do you know who he is by any chance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Boys and Men, the book he wrote,
Yeah. And the reason I threw that in is because one of the pieces, I don't look at things anymore, and I actually used to look at things and go, yeah, there's an inner child that's X years old, and if people want to use that concept, that still makes some sense. But what I've actually seen is that people actually become that age. Mm. It's not like, and especially if it's a big deal, it's not like we're 25 or 35 or 45 or 74 that we go, oh, there's there's this part of me that's younger, and we can look at it that way. But when we really struggle, we actually become that age. We can be a 50-year-old person, and literally inside, we can be 13. We don't live there all the time, but in any given moment, we could be that there. Mm. If there's a major trauma or a major loss, we become really young. A good friend of mine recently very suddenly lost his father. And he called me, and he was like, he could barely talk. And he couldn't string 3 words together. So he was literally about 1.5 or 2 years old. And he's a very bright, very competent man in the world, and we've been friends for many, many, many years. But it's like he at that moment was 2-ish. And part of what happens is that when we go back to those different developmental stages, and by the way, women do the same thing. We're talking about men here, but men and women do this. And I also want to put in a piece here around speaking. I don't want to do men and women in a binary way, because I do think that we're not fully binary. But I don't know. I don't want to say that. have to say that every time I speak. I just want to put that out
Right.
there. But when we go back to those younger places, whomever is across from us listening to us, whether if someone's a coach, if someone's a therapist, if someone's a husband or wife, if somebody is a partner, if someone is a dear friend, we have to be able to recognize that that person in that moment is younger. And we have to gear our language, and we have to gear our expectations, and we have to gear our ability to see, hear, and get and protect and cherish that person where they're at right then. And what will happen is that when we do that, the person often, they get seen and heard as, say, a 2-year-old, and that actually helps them grow back up. But that's how we meet somebody, because if we're really doing a relationship, we want to be able to really meet somebody. So somebody can be 30 years old, and if they're going through a really, really tough time, or a trauma, or a breakup, or a grieving a death, or they're not 30 years old. They're 30 years old in their body, but on an emotional level, on a developmental level, they're not 30 years old in that moment. And we don't always know exactly where someone's going to go, but usually they go pretty young.
Yeah. Yeah. That piece feels so incredibly important. What's coming to mind right now is so many times, it happens with my family a lot actually, where someone will be going through a process, or even friends as well, and maybe they're criticizing me, or maybe they're complaining, or they're blaming or something. And obviously I'm not perfect at this, but I have come a long way in like really being able to sit with it and not like take what they're saying so personally as like, oh no, I did something wrong, but seeing like the undercurrent of, you know, what's moving through them, this process that is needed to, that really needs to happen right now. And I'm being asked to just be here and witness and be with them. And an important piece to what you're sharing feels like we have to be making contact with them in that space.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. If I come in and I say, this is just making this up. I'm trying to make something up that people would get. If I say, you know, Blake, you don't care about me because blank.
Mm-hmm.
That's not an adult place that I'm coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And, for instance, let's say that I'm not able in a particular moment to separate personhood and behavior. And what I mean by that is, if I make a mistake, it means I made a mistake. It doesn't mean I'm a bad human being. I just made a mistake. If I feel like I made a mistake, but I'm judging myself for it, that's not being able to separate personhood and behavior. We learn to separate personhood and behavior between about 2 and 4 years old in a healthy process, a healthy developmental process.
How? By having someone there with us.
You mean as a little kid?
Yeah, like that piece feels really important. I think a lot of people in our culture really struggle with that piece.
They do, we do a lot.
Yeah.
And we struggle with it all the time. Men struggle with this a lot because, and I'll just throw in a few pieces, then I will answer your question. Because I think the question that you asked, I think is super important. Men struggle with this, and I think in some ways as much or more than women do. And that we judge ourselves on whether we're big enough and strong enough and smart enough and sexy enough and leadership enough, and whether our penises are big enough, and whether we can get hard when we're supposed to get hard or want to get hard, or or whether we lose our erection or whether we come too fast, or, all of those things. We go into we take dives into deep holes of spiraling holes that aren't very good for us. And the biggest part of that comes because of judgment. And does that make sense to you? Are we on a...
You mean like spiraling into holes of shame and self and
holes of shame, holes of self-judgment, holes of I'm not good enough, holes all of those things.
Yeah.
And the way that we learn to begin separating personhood and behavior is by our parents doing that for us when we're between 2 and 4. Because part of what happens, we go through a process of being incredibly confluent from birth to about 17 or 18 months old, and then we begin walking. We actually have a developmental process where our brains begin to shift and we have cognitive developmental change where we begin to know that we're symbols, that we mean something to somebody else around 2-ish. And it's also when language begins in earnest. Language starts before that, but language really begins in earnest. And what we're able to process cognitively is that symbols have meaning. Like a scribble on a page, if we draw something that looks like if I were to spell my name, Duey, if someone is 1 year old, they look at it and it's a scribble on a page. That's all it is. At some point, there's the beginning of the process where those scribbles on the page actually have meaning. So it's a process of that symbols have meaning is what we begin going through between 2 and 4 on a cognitive level. We don't fully grow into that until 8 or 10, but that's when we begin that process. But we also get that we're symbols to our parents. We begin to we have meaning to our parents. And that's why when we say no, and we see our parents maybe get upset, we go, oh, I can affect somebody else, so I have meaning. Mm-hmm. That's a quick and dirty of that. The message that we need to be able to receive is the message of I love you and blank, whatever that is. And love to a 2 or 3 year old can be just said. It can also be transmitted through touch. It can be transmitted through standing close to somebody. It can be all of those kinds of things. So the message is, sweetie, and I'll just give this example. Sweetie, I love you, and it's not okay to throw your oatmeal on the floor. Mm-hmm. That's that separation. That's how we learn that. That's different than if I throw my oatmeal on the floor and I hear bad boy.
Which is the common thing that most people hear.
Yes. Now, here's the part about this that a lot of people miss is, let's say I eat my oatmeal and I get told I'm a good boy. It's the same message. Mm-hmm. It's that lack of separation. So let's say that I eat my oatmeal and someone goes, what a good boy you are. And I'm like 3 years old. And I go, yay. But then the next morning I throw my oatmeal on the floor and I might get told, I love you and it's not okay to throw your oatmeal on the floor. But those are two different messages. So I'm sitting there going, what the fuck is the right message? Which one should I listen to? That makes sense? So we need... Go ahead.
I'm thinking of sports.
Yeah.
Like a huge one for so many people. I mean, and maybe that's a little bit after 4 years old, but I assume that it still maybe has some sort of effect, even 6 to 8 or something. Like, we learn so much that it's like all performance based.
It's all performance based, and you're a good person if you do it right. You're a bad person if you do it wrong. And we even see it. I mean, I see it in pro athletes.
Yeah.
There was a period of time, and I'll come back to this. There's a period of time, again, this is a bit of a long story, where I spent probably 4 years working with Olympic athletes. I live in Colorado, and Boulder I don't live in Boulder, but I'm like 45 minutes from there, is a hotbed for Olympic athletes, especially the endurance athletes, the runners, the skiers, the triathletes, the bicyclists. And I worked a lot with super, super high level athletes. I mean, athletes where I couldn't even think about staying up with them. But it's like, if I don't perform at my very best, then I'm a horrible human being. And so, yeah, you're right. It goes into sports. Yeah. So that piece of having a consistent message of, sweetie, I love you, and it's not okay to throw your oatmeal on the floor, needs to be consistent with, sweetie, I love you, and thank you for eating your oatmeal. Mm-hmm. You're learning how to do that really well. Or, sweetie, I love you, and it's not okay to yell and scream. Or, sweetie, I love you, and you asked me so nice. So we need that level of consistency. And the same way, the same way with relationships. Like, I could tell, if I say, and if I say to my partner, you look great, and I love you. But another time I go, well, you don't look as good in those clothes. What am I going to get? Or I could say, sweetie, I love you, and that doesn't fit you very well. Or I could say, sweetie, or you look great, babe. Yeah. I'm doing the exact same thing that we want to try to hold off on doing with infants. And the same way with my friends. In every endeavor, it's like, and there's a lot, we don't have to walk around going, every time I see you, go, Blake, I love you, and great job on the podcast. We don't have to do that. Well, we can do that energetically. We can do that emotionally. We can do that with touch. We can do that with kindness. We can bring that I love you statement in all kinds of different ways.
Wow. That's powerful. I've heard the I love you and before, but I haven't necessarily thought about it or heard it in the way of you're saying, which is that you don't have to say the words. It's actually it's the presence you bring. It's the way that you interact with them. It's the touch. It's like, you are okay, and I still care about you and love you, and whatever. The thing is, I want to shift gears a little bit.
Totally.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about with this is, for the most part, parents are trying to do their best, right? Which I know you would agree with. And saying bad boy or bad girl, like, they're trying to raise a kid in the best way that they know how to. And they think that if they do that, if they say bad boy, then it's going to breed an older person that it behaves in the right way. But I want to go back to instinct. It's something I really want to talk about. And when I think about attachment and instinct, I've heard people talk about it in that it is an instinctual thing that we do.
The attachment piece.
Attachment.
Absolutely.
And like in indigenous cultures, attachment was extremely understood. Where did we lose that? Like, where did that instinct of, oh, okay, I know that this is how I'm supposed to interact with a child, like, where did that get interrupted? More on a collective level.
Yeah. Well, I think actually, no one's ever asked me that question that way. So, great question. Instinct comes from the inside out, and from our core in our body inside out. That's where instinct comes from. Instinct is not an intellectual process. Instinct is a knowing from the inside out. And knowing that in your bones and knowing that in your, what I would say, heart and soul. And I'm not talking about soul from the religious standpoint. I'm talking about soul from a very, very grounded standpoint. And like we have about 5 acres of land here, and most of it is wooded. And if I go up and lay on the ground and in the upper part where it's just thick forest, I actually sink into the earth and become part of earth. That's instinctual. Where we have lost it is we have so much emphasis on our brains and on intellect that we lose our bodies. And what I see happening is that our bodies become this machine that carries our head around. Mm-hmm. And versus going our bodies actually, if you or others know about polyvagal theory, are you familiar with that at all? Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to go super into it, but in polyvagal theory, with our vagus nerve, which is a huge nerve that runs from our brainstem down through virtually all of our body, and it's called polyvagal because there's more than one branch, is that 80% of the information from that nerve comes from our body to our brain. It's not the other way around. That there's so much emphasis on brains and intellect that we end up losing our bodies. And we end up being very disconnected from our bodies. Like I will take people out and we'll be wandering a bit outside and I'll say, which way is north? And people go. If I have 10 people, I get pretty much every direction because we don't have that instinctual part of even knowing where the sun is and where the sun is in the part of the day that actually can tell us, and having a knowing of finding our place in nature is we have lost that. We have lost being able to find our place and know our place and be in our place. And there are many people, many mystics that really talk about that we're defined by our place versus what we have tried to do is the concept of dominion over the earth, which is a big part. And I don't want to get into bashing religions or anything, but it's a huge part of some religious processes of dominion over the earth instead of being part of the earth, because we've lost that. And in that process of having dominion, it's the same. It's the same piece that goes along with being intellectual with everything and using our brains to run everything. So that's one aspect of it. And I think there's another piece that actually Gabor Mate brings in where, and this goes right back to the attachment piece, is that Mate, and I think this is brilliant, and I wish to God I would have thought of it, but I'm really glad that people like him are around, is that there are many times where we give up our authenticity to try to get attachment. And so, but in giving up that part of our authenticity is the instinctual part of ourselves and the knowing from the inside out. And when we give that up to try to get attachment, we lose both. We lose authenticity, and we also lose attachment, because attachment without authenticity is not true attachment. It's a pseudo attachment. It's a very fragmented attachment. So,
fascinating.
That makes some sort of sense.
It makes some sort of sense. It feels like something I'm going to need to chew on a bit longer after the podcast, and then maybe we can circle back on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd be happy to do that.
This topic is so incredibly interesting to me, and I think it's easy to forget that we are in this animal body, and we have these evolved brains as of recently in the grand scheme of time on planet Earth. But, human beings walked this earth for much longer than we had these new evolved brains, and maybe we wouldn't call them human beings, and we were completely living instinctually. Like, we depended on our instincts for every, moment of our life. And in a way, like, my intuition is that still lives within us, that animal. And so I agree with you in everything you said, and I'm not that I want to go here because I don't think anyone necessarily knows, but I'm very curious, like, if there was something that happened, where was that break where we started to say, like, life is safer when we operate from our minds, or however you would want to say it.
Yeah. I think that what you're asking is really valid. And I do think there's a break in there. I think there was a relatively specific era of time. From what we know, our forebrain, or our prefrontal lobe, began developing about 80,000 years ago, from the best that we know and from the research I've done. Is that 100% accurate? I don't know that for sure, because I don't know if anyone knows that for sure. Mm-hmm. But what our prefrontal lobe did was, the development of prefrontal lobe allowed us to make up fiction. It allowed us to be able to think about things that weren't there. For instance, horses have a prefrontal lobe, but it's about the size of a walnut. Now, the rest of their brain is the same size as ours, but our prefrontal lobe is as big as our fist. So we carried that instinctual part for easily 70 to 80,000 years. The big shift with getting rid of our instinctual part, or not paying as much attention to our instinctual part, has had, from my perspective, to do with the advent of agriculture, which really began about 12,000 years ago and has developed more and more and more and more into how we live. And if anyone wants to know more about that, I'm happy to share some information about that. But when that 12,000, when we started moving into an agricultural society, and the agricultural revolution is what it's called, is that we started putting fences around fields, and we started cutting down trees to get enough sun on the crops, and we started protecting land to be able to say, this is my field of corn, you don't get to do this, and you don't get to be a part of it, those kinds of things. And again, it wasn't like that happened over a period of time, but we started moving into, with agriculture, we started, and I'm sure it wasn't this way in the very beginning, where someone was able to plant 3 rows of corn and they would have more corn for the winter. But it began when that agriculture is the beginning of our dominion over the earth versus living with the earth. And what's interesting about it is we still could do agriculture in relationship with the earth. We just don't. And, but from what I've been able to put together and what makes sense to me is we really have lost that instinctual piece when we move from pretty much pure hunter-gatherer people to agricultural people, because when you do agriculture, you have to stay in one place. You can't wander hundreds of miles. You have to, quote, protect your corn or your wheat or your whatever. And so, and agriculture is even a bigger deal than domesticating animals, because animals can move with us. We know that animals would move with people for years, for centuries, not just decades. But you can't take a field of corn with you.
Yeah. Right. And it's easy when you feel like you finally like mastered, okay, being able to stay in one place, grow food, sustain myself, like a sense of better than, a sense of ownership.
Yeah.
And there feels like there's something so symbolic to me about the concept of fences, putting up fences around our property. And it's almost like when we did that, we put up a fence around our ability to make contact with other. And so with the earth, but not only with the earth, with other people, because it all feels like it's emanating from that same place within us, the place that we are making contact from. And so it's like we started cutting off from relationship. And there's so much that I would like to talk to you about in terms of that piece. So we'll save that. I do want to be mindful of your time. The last piece that I want to touch on, if you could explain to me how/why we are scared of being scared, and what does that even mean?
Before I jump into that, because it's really important to me that I give credit where credit's due. It's wisdom. Mm-hmm. It's the wisdom of the wilderness, I think. Gerald May. And he spoke about that. One of the things that happens, and this actually goes back to attachment too, and I'll tie this in, is that our fear of being afraid stops us from moving in any direction. Our fear of being afraid is what stops us from taking risks, from trying new things, from entering into certain relationships. And what happens is that we actually make up fiction about what's going to happen if I do X, Y, and Z. And if I do X, Y, and Z, I might be afraid when I'm in the middle of that. So if I have a fear of loss, if I have a fear of fear, if I have a fear of that process, then what happens is that I won't go there. So versus having trust in yourself of if I go there, if I dive in to a relationship with somebody, or if I'm diving into even this podcast of, if I'm afraid of, if I go, well, things might not turn out well, or maybe our internet will go down or whatever, then the process is that I'm not allowing myself to trust myself. Mm-hmm. And so what will happen is, and actually in August, I'm leading a horseback trip for a group of men. So 5.5 day trip, might be 6.5, I forget. But it's like people go, well, I'm afraid of horses. And it's like, and what I talked to a couple of men about is it's like, actually, I don't buy that. What I buy is that you're afraid that you're going to be afraid. Because you don't even know the horse that you're going to be next to. You don't even know what that energy is going to be. You don't know what experience that horse has been through. So, so we use it as a self-protective mechanism. But what that does is it actually doesn't allow us to protect ourselves. Because if I'm afraid of being afraid, I don't move. If I allow myself to go into a situation and go and trust myself, then I can do something with that. And that's a whole different process. But that's based on trusting myself. And most people go, well, what's that mean? So I'll tell you what I think that means, is that trusting myself is knowing that I can do what I need to do when I need to do it. And if I can hold that, then I don't need to walk in with being afraid, nor being afraid of being afraid. And it might mean I'm in the middle of something and I get scared to bejeebies scared of me. That's okay with me. It's like, all right, well, that's an experience in life. And it's just as valid of an experience in life as connecting with someone. It's just as valid as falling in love. But if I'm afraid of being afraid, then I won't enter into any relationship, and it stops every level of contact that I can have with anyone. And then that ties back into a whole attachment piece.
So many thoughts about this, so many examples that come to mind. One of them is like growing up not wanting to go to some sort of gathering, or maybe it's like a tryout, like a sports tryout, where I know that I'm not going to know anyone there. Mm-hmm. And I'm afraid that when I get there, that I'm going to be in a situation where I'm afraid to pursue others' connection, and that I'm going to be the odd man out, and then I'm not going to belong. And so I'm afraid that when I get there, I'm going to be afraid. And so then I don't make any step and I don't go at all.
Right.
That's one. Going up and talking to a random girl. That's another huge one that I'm going to get right in front of her, and then I'm going to be extremely terrified.
Yeah, you'll be slobbering and your eye boogers coming out of your nose.
But I never end up actually approaching women because of that.
Right, exactly.
The other one that feels huge is the amount of people in the world who are so disenchanted with their life, with their relationships, with their careers, young men who don't know what to do, who are confused, who feel empty on the path that they're on, but they're so terrified to get off of that track and choose something different, because it's a fear that when we get off the track, all hell's going to break loose, we're going to fail, and we're going to be terrified then. And that's the big one that really came to mind.
Right. So then what happens is that we stay stuck where we're at and end up being incredibly unhappy. And then that unhappiness has to come out some way. And that's actually when depression comes out, or violence comes out, or cheating on wives or girlfriends come out, or cheating on other things to try and make money, or those sorts of things, instead of the process of going, okay, well, I am going to go up and talk to this girl, and I may get shut down. And, so I'm speaking now from a 74-year-old place, is whatever girl or / woman you walk up and talk to is just as nervous as you are. Mm-hmm. Because they're afraid that you're going to come up and talk to them. And then they're going to be afraid that they're going to be afraid of you coming up and talking to them. So both of you are standing, one in one corner of the room, the other in the other corner of the room, and both of you go home alone.
And we both actually want to talk to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
That's such a core piece of so many different arenas of life.
Yes, exactly.
It's like being afraid of the thing that we want.
Yes.
Duey, I want to be mindful of your time, but I do want to hear you just touch on briefly, like, what do we do about that? About the being afraid of being afraid, and the need of, like, softening and allowing.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is beginning to believe that piece. And this is a longer piece, and I am going to run out of time before I can dive into this. If you're open to it, I'm happy to set up another time with you and dive into some other things, because this has been wonderful. When we become afraid of being afraid, we are not living in the present. We're not. We are projecting into the future, And nobody knows what's going to happen 5 minutes from now. Nobody knows. And if you think you know, then you're probably full of beans. We can make guesses, but we don't know. And so the biggest piece is, there's actually two pieces. One is learning to live in the present. And when I say that, I mean really learn to live in the present. The other is being able to trust yourself, which is actually part of living in the present. And that's where it's like, I know I can do what I need to do when I need to do it. Even if it's walking up to the girl and trying and saying hi, and she goes, I have a boyfriend. Thank you so much. And wait, if that happens, it's like, I know I can go lick my wounds and move on. I know, or I can be disappointed. I know I can do that. I know that I have somebody to go talk to. I know that I can handle loss. I know that I can handle grief. I know that I can handle being turned away. But what I would suggest is that most people don't know that they can handle being accepted. And having, in this scenario, that metaphoric girl go, yeah, I'd love to talk to you. Because then it's like, now what the fuck do I say?
Mm-hmm.
No.
So good. So good. The other piece I would just want to say before we close is, if you're out there listening and you're like, yeah, I know that's me being scared of being scared, just giving yourself permission to acknowledge that. Be like, yeah,
absolutely.
I am scared of being scared. That's where I'm at, and it's okay.
And that's that separation of personhood and behavior. Like, yeah, I'm okay inside. I actually may shit my pants when I go talk to this girl, but I'm still going to be okay.
Yeah.
And to know that piece.
Right. Okay, we'll stop there, even though I could keep going. Duey, where would you like to send anyone who wants to get in touch with you, find more of your work?
Actually, Kimberly and I do a lot together, so I'm going to include her stuff. My main website is deweyfreeman.org, so I'm easy to find. I also run the Gestalt Equine Institute of the Rockies, which is learning. We teach people how to do therapy working with horses. And then Kimberly runs Ecotherapy Institute of Colorado. And we work together on all three of those. So those are three great resources. I also do a lot of stuff with Trevor Boehm through Man Uncivilized, and do a lot of stuff with Connor Beaton through Man Talk. So there's a lot of intertwining of who I'm working with and how I'm working. Mm-hmm. And I'm also working with you. So if people want to connect with somehow find me and none of those things work, I'm more than happy to have them connect with you, and then you and I do whatever we do with that. So
sounds great.
And what I'll also say, Blake, I didn't get a chance to read your book. I got a chance to look through it and read some of it. Very well done. And I'm really glad that you're doing what you're doing in the world. You're doing a great job here.
Thank you so much. Really, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your life, for your path, for all of your wisdom. Truly an honor to share this space, and looking forward to doing it more.
I'm totally open to that. Thank you, sir.